All right. Amazing. Hi, everyone, and happy International Museum Day. Welcome to this webinar hosted by the Chaco Culture Conservancy. I am Olivia Thompson, the Executive Director of the Conservancy. For those of you who may not be familiar with our organization, we are a 501c3 charitable organization and philanthropic partner to Chaco Culture National Historical Park and Aztec Ruins National Monument. Our mission is to inspire people to support, connect with, and learn about Aztec Ruins National Monument and Chaco Culture National Historical Park through philanthropy and volunteer activities, thus ensuring the preservation of the Chacoan architectural landscape, natural resources, and cultural heritage for present and future generations. With help from our generous donors, the Conservancy funds projects around both parks that, without our help, may go unfunded. We primarily support trails, preservation, and access projects. In fact, the CCC often supports projects that promote preservation of and access to museum collections and archives. The board of directors recently approved $18,000 worth of funding for projects for 2024, but there are still $89,000 worth of unfunded projects. As the year progresses, the CCC hopes to support more of these projects, but we can't do it without your help. A donation today will help ensure that this important work can be accomplished around the parks. These parks and the natural and cultural places and spaces that they encompass are important, sacred, and irreplaceable. The work that we do, the work that our donors enable us to do, provides crucial support to the National Park Service in their mission to preserve these landscapes. If you're interested in supporting our organization by making a donation today, I have put a link in the chat that will take you to our donation page. And if you're watching in the future, that link will be in the comments of this YouTube video that you're watching. Other ways to support include signing up for our newsletter, which you can also do on our website. Signing up for our newsletter ensures that you never miss news, updates, or ticket releases from the CCC. You can also follow us on social media. We are Chaco Culture Conservancy on Facebook and at Chaco Conservancy on Instagram. As always, the CCC thanks you so much for your support of our organization and of these incredibly important public lands. And thank you for joining us today for this very special webinar. Before we get started, I will just remind you to keep yourselves muted for the duration of the webinar. We will have time for a Q&A after Cynthia's talk. So if you have questions as she's talking or after her talk, you can drop them in the chat. And to do that, if you're not familiar with Zoom, you'll see a bar at the bottom of your screen with a little chat box that says chat, and you can just click on that and enter your comment or question in there. So now I'm thrilled to introduce you all to Cynthia Wiley, who will be speaking about some lesser known items in the Chaco and Aztec collections. Cynthia is the museum curator for Aztec Ruins National Monument and Chaco Culture National Historical Park, and is the site lead for the Chaco-Aztec Museum and Archives facility in Albuquerque. Cynthia, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Olivia. I really appreciate the opportunity to share today about the museum collections of Chaco Culture National Historical Park and Aztec Ruins National Monument on this International Museum Day, when we're celebrating museums for education and research. I remember sitting in Anthropology 102, Introduction to Archaeology and Prehistory, back in Wisconsin more than 20 years ago. After touring briefly through Roman, Greek, and Mayan archaeology, our overviews turned to the southwestern United States and Chaco. I had heard of Chaco before that class. I can't remember when I first heard of this place. Regardless, when I wrote my term paper on one small aspect of Chaco, I never dreamed that I would one day be entrusted as a steward of museum collections for two Chacoan sites. And I certainly did not think I would ever have the honor of meeting descendants of the ancestral Pueblo people who lived there. The National Park Service has managed the lands known as Aztec Ruins National Monument and Chaco Culture National Historical Park since the early 1900s. The National Park Service recognizes 26 modern-day tribes as traditionally associated with these lands for more than 10,000 years. Objects removed from Chaco and Aztec were removed and spread to different museums in the late 19th and early 20th century by organized institutional expeditions and individuals looking for profit alike until President Roosevelt proclaimed Chaco-Canyon National Monument under the Antiquities Act of 1906. And then later, Aztec Ruins National Monument was protected in 1923. Objects from the Aztec area were also removed routinely prior to those organized excavations funded by the American Museum of Natural History in the 1910s. Today, items from both these parks can be found in museum exhibits and storage from New York, Boston, and Washington, D.C. to England, Mexico, and Finland and beyond. These are the items most people bring to mind when they think of Chaco and Aztec museum objects. The National Park Service cares for objects, specimens, photographs, and documents created or excavated only after each park unit's designation as a national monument, unless otherwise donated to the parks. But we do not have direct legal title to anything removed before each individual parcel of land came under National Park Service authorization. More than 100 years later, the Chaco and Aztec Museum and Archival collections are cared for by a small National Park Service staff at storage and exhibit locations on site in Aztec Ruins National Monument, Chaco Culture National Historical Park, and at the Chaco-Aztec Museum and Archives facility located in the Hibbins Center for Archaeology in Albuquerque. Some items are cared for in additional specialty repositories operated by the National Park Service and various universities, but those items remain under the legal control of the National Park Service. Here we have data from the fiscal year 2023 Collection Management Report. This is a document that the parks provide to both the leadership at the National Park Service and the Department of Interior each year that eventually get rolled up into reports to Congress. As you can see at the end of 2023, which would have been September 30th of 2023, Chaco Culture National Historical Park collections totaled 2,707,645. Archives are surprisingly the largest discipline represented. They have surpassed the archaeological collections, which many people don't expect. And furthermore, many people don't realize the full extent of materials that are represented in those archives, which I hope to share about today with you. The bolded disciplines here are the ones that we'll be talking about today and we'll be sharing from primarily. Most people are quite aware of what the archaeological collections can hold. Aztec Ruins National Monuments data from the 2023 report show over 200,000 items in the archaeology collection, which remains the largest collection for this park unit. These are the same types of figures as I just shared for Chaco. A new focus on inventorying and processing archival materials for Aztec will likely boost the Aztec archive figures dramatically over the next few years. We also have a large amount of cataloging of archaeology items to do. The figures here represent estimates that include all unprocessed collections that we have documented. As we work on processing those uncatalogued archaeological collections and archival collections, these numbers will fluctuate up and down as they're refined. Combined, Aztec and Chaco have 3.1 million objects, specimens, and documents, and this makes this the second largest park collection in the National Park Service Intermountain region. That is second to Yellowstone and is larger than the Grand Canyon, Mesa Verde, or Rocky Mountain National Parks collections. To care for these items, we have 3 permanent National Park Service museum staff. We have the museum curator, myself. We have a wonderful archivist named Brenna Lissaway, and we have a fabulous museum technician named Samantha Baumkamp. The programs at Chaco, the Museum and Archives programs at Chaco and at Aztec merged 3 years ago to have responsibilities for both parks equally, and this is consistent with the overall co-management of these 2 parks. As funding allows, we partner with the University of New Mexico Museum Studies program, the National Council for Preservation Education, and other organizations to employ current or recent graduates to help train the next generation of resource stewards and invest in the future. Particularly, we prefer to collaborate with partners who have a focus on diversity that allow us to bring in Indigenous individuals as well. That's a real focus for our program. Now, as I said before, most people do focus on the objects that we typically label as part of the archaeology discipline, the items that were left behind by people living in Chaco and Aztec during the 8th to 13th centuries CE. But there really is so much more in the National Park Service curated collections. I will say the new the new Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act regulations, this act is usually referred to as NAGPRA, that were released in January 2024 have really created an opportunity to increase the involvement of descendant communities in stewardship of these museum objects. And while we work to understand and implement the new regulations, this is part of why we're taking the opportunity to focus on these lesser known or rarely seen portions of the the park's museum collections for today's webinar. We have no desire to violate the regulations as we work to understand them. We're going to start with architecture. And no, architecture is not a standalone discipline in the National Park Service for museum collections, as I just shared those. Items related to architecture are commonly classified as archaeology, history, archives, or whatever feels appropriate for each park unit's context. But when we bring those elements back together from the multiple disciplines, they really create a story for all of us to understand. Visitors to the parks will probably spend most of their time experiencing and exploring the monumental architecture developed by the people of Chaco and Aztec. The layout, the height, the expanse. They'll experience the changes through the centuries by the communities as they refined their skills and responded to cultural pressures that we may never understand unless we are gifted Indigenous knowledge from descendant communities. And we do consider that a gift when given. The parks and the general public have no inherent rights to such information. A lot of what we keep are mortar samples from these structures, not only of the original materials used by the ancestral Pueblo people to build the structures at Chaco and Aztec, but also materials that have been used in preservation repairs since then. This serves as a record of park actions and helps to refine mortar recipes for park preservation staff as they continue in these tasks. We really seek to preserve a full history of these structures. Wood samples. We do have objects made of wood, but additionally, we care for sections of wood used for the vigas and latias, the large beams and smaller cross beams that separate the floors, the stories of the buildings, as well as part of the roofs. In the pre-National Park Service repairs, often individuals reused wood because it's not readily available, as we know from much publicized recent research about where the wood was brought from. So really, by preserving this wood, we can sometimes see those early stabilization efforts when it's needed to be replaced. And we're preserving, again, multiple chapters of these structures' history. Some of the rooms in the structures at Chaco and Aztec both were in very early days retrofitted and utilized for museum storage. So this wood is not only a history of the structures themselves, but also a history of the very museum program I manage. And also, I mentioned before, dendrochronology wood samples are often cared for at the Laboratory of Tree Ring Analysis as one of our specialty repositories. The Laboratory of Tree Ring Analysis is at the University of Arizona in Tucson. But they don't accept all. They also sample and choose which items will be stored there as part of the larger dendrochronology effort. Many of those samples come back to us, and we do curate them on site so that they can be available for research in the future for dendrochronological purposes if necessary as well, or to study what types of wood were being used, or whatever research question may come to mind by experts in those fields. So we do store some of those. We also store cores that helped to determine the different types of wood present and to document that for future research, as well as to be able to replicate past research. We curate paint chips. That's not something most people would think of. The Aztec Visitor Center is a historic structure in its own right, and the National Park Service is required by the National Historic Preservation Act to manage it for those qualities of craftsmanship and architectural style. The museum collection contains architectural samples to record its history and assist with its preservation. So you can see here, there are 5 paint samples, all from the visitor center doors. These were taken and preserved for future reference as they relate to specific eras of the building. And this might not be as interesting to the general public, maybe not something you'd ask to see on a tour of the collections, but specimens like this preserve critical data that impacts the visitor experience of the historic landscape that is present and superimposed on the ancestral Pueblo and landscape at Aztec ruins. We also curate architectural models. The ones on this slide were professionally produced and sold at one time. These models are really an artifact of different people's perception of place over time. And through this, we can see how people perceived the information we had at the time the model's design was produced. They also help communicate those ideas to others who see the models. There are other architectural models in our collections. Again, we use the museum collections to see perceptions of architecture and place through time. This group of models of various Chacoan structures were imagined by the University of New Mexico archaeology students in 1938. These were the results of a class project. Some students chose to represent their vision of what the structures looked like while they were inhabited, while others chose to model what they saw then on the ground, down to small pots and objects in the building. Paleontology. Most people think of archaeology, but really the landscape has been in use for even longer than the 10,000 years that we acknowledge. The fossils are present on the landscape. They're part of the story of the land. They were potentially the ancestral Pueblo people interacted with them as well, saw them, wondered about them, had stories about them, had their own knowledge of the fossils. Our parks do not have large fossil collections, partially related to what the purpose of the park is, but also where priorities have been over time. But we do maintain some examples of fossils found within the park. And there is an opportunity for some fossils to be more fully examined and identified. Many of our fossils have been identified to a high level, but really many of them say unknown when it comes to genus and species, and that impacts our ability to say really specific things about the fossil history for these parks. So there's an opportunity here for professional paleontologists to revisit these identifications and match them with new scientific discoveries and understanding so that we in turn can understand this landscape better. In these pictures, we have an unidentified reptile on the left. We know that it's from and I apologize to the geologists, I will say this incorrectly, the Menifee formation of the Cretaceous period. But that's all we really know about it. More fossils from Chaco specifically. The fossil on the far left is a turtle. And we have a large part of its carapace as well as some other bone fragments. And this is an example of one that has been previously identified as the only one of its kind in New Mexico to be found. And yet it is currently under review by paleontologists to potentially reclassify it with more knowledge that we have gained in the last 40 years since the fossil was originally identified. We also have bony fish fossils. These are the fossils that many fossil hunters, go up to southwestern Wyoming and love to go legally fossil hunting for fish on quarries that make that available up there. And we obviously have some examples of similar types here at Chaco. And then we have shark's teeth, which is super fun. Kids always love shark's teeth, and to think about sharks swimming through Chaco Canyon when you visit it today is always an exercise in imagination. Aztecs not to be left behind with paleontology. Here we have a crinoid, as well as some other small sea creatures that were not identified in my information around it. And it's just a great little snapshot of sea life in the Great Interior Sea back when that was what the landscape looked like. We have a lichen collection for Chaco. They were all collected at the same time. So we have a single snapshot of lichen at Chaco. But there's a real potential here. Lichen is extremely responsive to changes in the climate over time. And so as we continue to engage with climate change research in the parks for both natural resources reasons and cultural resource reasons, to just generally understand what's happening better, this lichen could be a real potential tool in the future to compare changes in the lichen and understand how it's responding to what we know is happening in the environment. And I have to confess, before this presentation, I didn't actually even know I had a lichen collection I was caring for. It's not something that I personally thought of very much for Chaco. In the biology category, we also do have some specimens that are preserved through taxidermy, such as our friend the snake on the right, who was preserved in an upright position, which makes it really fun. And I need to put a warning on the cabinets for my employees because he has given many of them a big start when they opened up the cabinet and looked down the drawer and saw him staring back. All of our specimens a year and a half ago were tested using XRF technology, and I apologize, I'm completely blanking on what XRF stands for at the moment. But XRF technology is a non-destructive technology that can look at what elements are present. And several of our taxidermied specimens were actually found to be contaminated with arsenic, likely used in the taxidermy process. But sometimes we do find it was later applied if there was a pest issue at play. We have no record of that for these specimens, and since they've been in our custody, so we believe it was likely used in the preservation process initially. Any specimens that are found to be impregnated with arsenic, mercury, basically these chemicals that were used in the past to preserve items against pests or against decay, we carefully enclose them. Some items are we know how to treat them now through conservation work, but there are other items that we're not really sure how to handle that, or it's going to be an extremely expensive event and we have to prioritize that within all of our needs. So when that happens, we carefully contain those materials within archival packaging to a degree that staff won't accidentally touch them with bare hands, for example, won't breathe in any dust, that kind of thing. And we clearly put warning tags on them so that we don't have accidental exposures while we understand how to mitigate this threat to staff. We also have a flora collection, comparative collection. It was collected during the 1970s by the Chaco Center during the Chaco Project, and the idea was, as I understand from the documentation, to collect a wide range of plants from the San Juan Basin area to not only compare to specimens that are found archaeologically from the past, but also, again, it serves as that snapshot in time, and whether they were really thinking about this during the time of the collection or not, we once again have this sample, the snapshot sample, as we look at changes to the landscape due to climate change that could be useful for researchers to compare to in the future. And that is that lovely little prickly cactus there. I will say, isn't one of the tallest walled boxes in that entire cabinet, because we're all very aware how quickly we could become one with that specimen. Other biology collections are the pressed plant collections, typical of herbaria. This is the wonderful thing about the Aztec herbaria in particular, is that it was very robustly collected with multiple copies, because these specimens can be fairly delicate and difficult to handle. And so what a lot of herbaria are doing is they are digitizing them and putting them online. So researchers who don't need to actually physically handle the specimens can do their work using the digitized scans, or the digital scans, excuse me. There are still occasionally needs for researchers to look at the actual specimen themselves. And again, from what I'm hearing from my ecologist and botany friends, most often that is tied to climate change studies. So this is an example of where, even though most people utilize the digital versions now, the digital surrogates, it's not, we can't get rid of the originals. We can't go to wholly digital. So what I have here is a screenshot from SEINet, which is the portal on the internet that anyone can access. And this is where most herbariums are putting their specimens on for people to look at and access easily. This specimen actually does belong to Aztec Ruins National Monument and was put online on SEINet by the Deaver Herbarium at Northern Arizona University. And all of Aztec's herbarium specimens are actually cared for at other herbariums, the University of New Mexico Southwest Museum, Museum of Southwest Biology, the Deaver Herbarium at Northern Arizona, as well as San Juan College in Farmington, New Mexico, close to home, also has a robust herbarium. And so what this allows, by maintaining those specimens in the herbaria instead of in the parks collections, is it allows researchers to access a number of specimens across the regions they're studying in one location. It's very unusual for someone studying plants to really want to look only at the specimens from a single site. So in line with the nature of this type of research, putting them at a location where they can be not only cared for by curators who specifically know how to care for these items, they can also be of appropriate access. But if you're ever just wanting to look at plants from Aztec, sei.net has, they're mostly all digitized and on there, and I know I've actually used them to answer confusing questions I've had about specimens in my documentation before. So I highly recommend it if you're into plants and that's a passion of yours. Archives. Most commonly, when people make archives requests, they're looking for the data and the reports of the immense amount of research that was completed at these parks, the archaeological investigations, the biology studies, including water-based insects, hydrology studies, soil study results, all the research and data from both research conducted by the parks, as well as people who hold research permits through the parks. We do require that those permitted researchers provide us with a copy of their data and papers so that it continues to be available for park management purposes, but also for future research. The archives hold building plans of current and past park infrastructure that can come into play. Recently, we were looking to resolve a question about the Chaco Visitor Center, and part of that question was resolved by looking at the plans and recommendations from the previous building that had been there. And so that was really helpful. So even if a building's gone, not only is it interesting from just a historical perspective, but it can continue to answer questions about current infrastructure as well. We have a manuscript collection. One example is the Armand Winfield collection. This is the blurb from the finding aid that you can use to discover more about this collection. But it includes an unpublished manuscript, a semi-biographical account of Armand Winfield's experience at the Chaco Field Schools. It also contains a photocopy of his scrapbook, glass lantern slides that relate to Chaco Canyon. So in this collection, but manuscript collections are materials that are not by nature created by or legally owned by the government in this case, but are a person's a personal account type situation where that is donated to us. So so someone in Winfield's family provided this to us. We have photographs. We see photographs on social media put out by the parks, by the Conservancy, and we really have quite a wide range, not just pictures of Pueblo Bonito and Kettle and the sites in Aztec West that people expect to see, but also this is part of a fauna photo collection of photos of animals at the parks. This is a loggerhead shrike perched on a straw hat. We have many pictures of animals, plants, landscapes, skies, etc. at Chaco that do not, when you look at them, do not immediately call to archaeology, but still tell you about these places. We have a lot of contemporary and historic photographs as well. We have photos of stabilization crews going back decades and decades. And in the past, they would have captions like, Navajo workers or Navajo preservation crew workers or something like this. And maybe they would name the foreman if he happened to not be indigenous. But some of the work that I'm very proud my staff has been trying to do over the last few years is give names as much as possible to those people that were not even given names in the past. And one of the really cool and amazing ways we've been able to do that is because so many of those past, they were called stabilization crews in the past, but or now we call them preservation crews, but regardless of name for the crew, many of the people in those past photos, their sons, nephews, cousins, or some other relation are now working for our preservation crews. And so our current crews are actually helping us with this task to identify those people and give them their names back for history. Here's an example too, though, of archaeologist Zorro Bradley and his wife, Natalie Dodge Bradley, photographing objects at Chaco. We have these photos that capture life and research and what it was like, how people did the work that ended up in those publications. We have oral histories. Oral histories are interviews of the past, employees, researchers, and others that were interviewed during various oral history projects about Chaco. Some have been park sponsored and some have not. We don't have very many oral histories for Aztec ruins. But oral histories are really a chance to preserve the past in people's own words without applying an external lens, but really what they were thinking and feeling. And it's a real opportunity to put that together. So in these pictures you see before you, on the left is a photo of threatening rock before it fell on Pueblo Bonito. It's that large kind of squarish slab that's very distinct. And then in the photo on the right, that's a profile image utilized by the Park Service to show that separation of that slab from the cliff face. Again, before it fell on Pueblo Bonito. And for those not familiar with this story, threatening rock fell in 1941 and destroyed the back section of Pueblo Bonito. And today there's actually a trail through Pueblo Bonito that when you walk on it, you climb up on the debris from when threatening rock fell, and you can read a exhibit wayside that tells you more. So we're gonna hope this works. I actually have an oral history excerpt from you for you to listen to. That is Gwyn Vivian, who was a prominent Southwest archaeologist until his passing a few years ago. And his father was the first, I believe, the first National Park Service archaeologist at Chaco. If not the first, then one of the first. So Gwyn actually grew up living in Chaco Canyon. And we were very fortunate to capture an oral history with him just months before he passed. And then the photo on the left is after threatening rock fell in Pueblo Bonito, the day after, actually. And the photo on the right is Gwyn and his sisters. He's the one on the far right. So, and Olivia, please let me know if you can hear this.
She liked being out. She
We
loved
can hear it.
being in Chaco.
Oh, you can? Okay, good. I
She
can't.
loved riding horseback. She had the superintendent's wife. She and them. They were there when and another woman related to the Park Service when Threatening Rock fell down. And I can remember her talking about that later, that they were having, it was the morning when they were having, the ladies were having tea at the Vivian's on the other side of the canyon. So apparently this was something that happened once a week or something. Anyway, everyone knew it was moving. Bob Lister, incredibly enough, the day before, he was measuring the distance, and he jumped from the cliff edge onto the top of Threatening Rock to get a correct measurement the day before. And anyway, the ladies were having tea when there was this unbelievable sound, and they all knew immediately what had happened. And I can remember my mother saying they all rushed out from where we were on the other side and saw nothing but this massive amount of dust. And so jumped in a car, drove over, and began climbing all over this big, huge, broken pieces, which were still on the ground level, still dropping. I mean, you could hear things clunking, and then somebody woke up and thought, we're crazy. You know, some big rock's gonna move, and we're gonna be under the rock. So they did get off. But they were there on the very day that it came down, like I say, at the Vivian's having tea.
So Gwyn is speaking about his mother when he's saying she. Gwyn was 6 years old when this event occurred. And that image on the left was somebody scrambling up, as he described, before maybe they thought that's not such a great idea. But again, you know, you can have data about the data that he described that was collected about the movement of threatening rock. You can have the story about what it was like to take those measurements. You can have newspaper clippings about, we have several from about, I think, 5 years before it fell, where they were assuring everyone it was safe and it was not going to fall. We have, you know, images of the before the fall, after the fall. We have a trail you can walk and get that, that story there. But when you can put all those elements together, you really get that bigger personal story and picture. So oral histories, when they can be captured and used, are such a great opportunity to move beyond our typically written culture and written storytelling to make it personal in a way that doesn't come across on the page. And our oral history program, I should say, we're very fortunate that our archivist has a great deal of experience in training in oral history and is able to capture some of these herself. She did the oral history interview that you heard there. But it is a specialized training skill set, and it's something that, you know, requires investment for the future as well.
She liked being out. She loved being in.
We have historic objects. Moving on there. Mr. Giate and during the last webinar, you know, referred to this, but Richard Wetherill certainly has a complicated role with Chaco-Aztec and many other ancestral Pueblo sites in the Four Corners region. But it is difficult to talk about the early 20th century without talking about him. During his time running a trading post and homestead within Chaco Canyon, prior to the land being transferred to the National Park Service, but to some degree, even after its designation, before the land was moved, the local Chaco post office was called the Putnam Post Office and was located, I believe, in his trading post. This is believed to be one of the doors of the individual mailboxes from the Putnam Post Office. The lock is missing, and some other elements, but this is one of my favorite new discoveries that are in the collection, because I truthfully never really even thought about the idea that Chaco Canyon would have had its own post office, but it was referred to as the Putnam Post Office, and this was found in a dump of historic materials within the park boundaries in the 1980s. Mentioned Richard Wetherill. Well, in 2006 to 2014, Dr. Wirt Wills, an archaeology professor with the University of New Mexico, led multiple field classes during the school year, and other student experiences at the behest of Chaco Culture National Historical Park. And it was started because staff found a sinkhole that was later found through investigations to be the Wetherill Homestead Well. Investigations of the well in later years were expanded to look at more of the homestead. As a result, the Wetherill Homestead collection is easily our largest historic archaeology collection, but it's larger than most of our of our collections that resulted from archaeological investigations into the sites for which Chaco was preserved. This collection is not yet fully processed and cataloged, but there is an immense amount of research potential for those interested in exploring early 20th century homesteading in rural New Mexico. It's just been touched. There's additional identifications needed. We know, for example, the far right photos is some of the bottles from that collection. There's a lot of dating resources available and identification resources for bottles. It would be wonderful to have that more rigorously applied to the bottles and see what we can learn there about what life was like during that period. We have a wrench, we have shoe fragments, we have a horse bridle, we have doorknobs. We have so many facets of that life available, that understanding where goods and materials were flowing from, and so many other research questions that people might spring to mind. So there's really a lot of research potential here for people interested in this facet of archaeology and history. We also have historic objects that are in some ways more related to the early history of the national park itself. On the far left, we have, I'm told, I'm not an antique car expert, but that are axle casings from an automobile. And then on the right, we have a horseshoe. And yet when you look at the 1924 ledger, which we have an image from in the middle, you'll see in the 1920s, there were an immense number of people starting to come out in automobiles on some of those automobile tours being offered. But there were also many people still coming in on horseback and on pack trains, whether on mules, horses, donkeys, or all of the above. So really, you see the change in the history of the landscape in that respect through these items, how people were coming in, and that transition to now we do occasionally see a motorcycle or bicyclist on the road, but it really is mostly cars. And we have the artifacts, or excuse me, the objects from that transition. There we go. We have other historical objects. There, during the Civilian Conservation Corps era of the 1930s, there was actually a unit set up called the Mobile Ruin Stabilization Unit, and it had a field station in Chaco Canyon, and it was unique because it was actually a crew of local indigenous people. And so we have documents from that. We actually have a whole archival series related to that. But we also have some objects that tie in. We have two boundary markers that say CCC on them that had to do with the CCC camp. Unfortunately, not many of our objects have been linked to the CCC camp in the way that some other parks like Yosemite and Shenandoah have. But it is also really reflective of the crew that was set up for Chaco and to work on the structures there. A new collection that we're beginning to consider and build is actually related to the Chaco Center or the Chaco Project. This was a separate unit of the National Park Service that began in 1971. It was headquartered at the University of New Mexico, and some of the individuals held joint appointment between the National Park Service and UNM, but it was a National Park Service unit. It was a separate unit of the park with the purpose of doing a thorough survey and investigation of Chaco, of what was then Chaco Canyon National Monument. And so it's a very unusual situation. This has not happened. It's very unique in the history of the National Park Service. So we received most of the Chaco Center materials when it was dissolved in 1985. The Chaco Center no longer exists. Most of their materials and their holdings were transferred to the park, and then the staff were reassigned to other offices and units. However, it is such an integral part of Chaco's history as a park and the management aspect of it. And they did do some work at Aztec ruins as well for special purposes, I should say, that we're just now grappling with not only maintaining records related to their work and objects that resulted from their work, but also the history of the center itself. For example, this is a sign that used to hang in the office, and while many people would say, well, it's a sign, it's a really important long term. It could be a really important communication artifact. Signs are literally just that. Sometimes they're signs that something existed. So this is actually something that we're considering adding to the collection right now. It's not previously really been in our scope of collecting to bring these items in. So we're having to carefully consider how we want to go about preserving the history of the Chaco Center through the museum collection. We also have, oddly enough, this might be a little bit of an oxymoron, contemporary historical objects. We have a responsibility to preserve the history of the park as it's happening. And a lot of that now happens through kind of these small items. So here we have a challenge coin for the Honoring Chaco initiative in 2023, just last year. The Secretary of Interior's office created this to hand out at Honoring Chaco initiative events, including the announcement in June. Archives, while the park did not produce this coin, archive staff for Chaco researched and helped locate the image that is used on that coin, as well as staff receiving it during that event. And then on the far right, we have a bandana that was created to celebrate Chaco's International Dark Sky designation in 2013. We also have some modern additions to the landscape that we look to preserve. We don't keep everything that visitors leave behind voluntarily, and we don't keep everything that is sent to us, but we do try to sample it as to preserve the changes or the continuance of meaning of the parks to people over time. So on the left, we have a very large quartz crystal. It's estimated at 35 pounds that was left at an archaeological site in 2012 for unknown reasons by unknown people. We can speculate. Every park staff member has their own internal story they tell. But the reality is we don't actually know why it was left. And the person didn't leave a name on it, so, or a letter or anything like that. And then on the right, we have a piece of mirrored artwork that was sent to the park by a visitor as a reflection of their Chaco experience and what it meant to them as expressed through art. So I've been going for a while and I know I'm talking a lot. So I thought to myself, what does this presentation need? More cowbell. So there we go. There's a historic cowbell that was also collected from the surface in the park at Chaco. That also shows the long history of cattle on the boundaries and within the park as well, during some of the later eras. So coming back to the theme of International Museum Day, museums for education and research. It's a big question that we get. Who is doing research and why? I can tell you that most of the research requests we receive are for archival materials, mostly scientific data reports, related photographs, etc., but also for documentaries. Or people, often textbooks are looking for photos so that they can write about Chaco in the textbook and continue that experience that I had over 20 years ago sitting in archaeology class. We are seeing requests that are specifically related to climate change, trying to get the information about the Chacoan water diversion features that the Ancestral Pueblo people had in place, how the park and later people had water diversion features and were molding where the water flowed in the park, information about how people were adapting to live in this landscape. We have other institutions who are engaging with the Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act responsibilities, and they need access to some of that data in our records to help them sort their own information. So often research at Chaco has been done in conjunction with research in other places where there's actually important information hidden in our records to help those institutions resolve their responsibilities, or at least address them. We get students working on theses and dissertations, not only from the University of New Mexico due to proximity, but other institutions as well. There are some gaps in where people are doing research. We don't have a lot of natural history research going on. A little bit less going on with the biology world and some of that work. Even the climate change research is largely for the parks is largely being driven from the cultural side, the archaeology side, preservation, etc. But in this image from 1952, you can see an erosion control feature and the flood damage to it, to what's called a rock sausage drop structure, which I found interesting. So to do research and education through museum collections, we have to make the collections discoverable and accessible. And the first thing we need to do is understand what we have in the collections so we can direct people to it. This involves making inventories, processing the collections, cataloging them, and doing consultation with associated tribes and pueblos or other appropriate stakeholders. We need to always be checking to make sure we aren't releasing legally protected information. We cannot give out some information to just anybody, and we try to make sure that we are doing that correctly and not incorrectly gatekeeping information from people who are legally allowed to have that information released to them. The Archaeological Resource Protection Act and the Paleontological Resource Protection Act both specify types of data that cannot be released or should not be released to the general public or people without appropriate qualifications to evaluate it. We're also always checking copyright for image-based resources to make sure we have the right to release it and that we don't have to refer you to another individual. Example is the Secretary of Interior's office sent us a different image they wanted to use on that coin, and we discovered that it was owned by a completely different institution that they would have to get permissions from. And so in the end, they elected to go with a different image that we did have copyright for. We want to make sure we're reviewing everything for sensitivity. Are we using correct terms and not being offensive to the associated tribes and pueblos? Do we have any concerns about how we exhibit or do research on or share images of items, or even how they're stored based on previous tribal consultation and the information they have chosen to share with us? We exist within a legal mandate, but we always want to be good partners. And researchers are coming to us in person, but increasingly they want information digitally for archival materials. So that's one of our challenges. There are portals existing to access. There's the Chaco Park website, which actually, if you go to the Learn About the Park section, has copies of archival finding aids for all the published finding aids for archival collections for the park. There is, Chaco will soon have a custom portal on NP Gallery, which is the digital asset management system for the National Park Service, that will allow you to view some of those images, and in the future, maybe documents that are in the archival collections. There's also just the general NP Gallery, and you can search for Aztec or Chaco in there and see images that the park has put up in the past, mostly contemporary items, or images of our parks that were uploaded by other institutions, such as the National Park Service History Collection, which is managed by the Harpers Ferry Center in West Virginia. We have the New Mexico Archives Online, where you can search not only for documents in the Chaco collections, and eventually we will get Aztec up in there too, but also other institutions. So you may find something you want related to Aztec ruins, for example, that is in the collections of the Southwest Center, the Center for Southwest Studies at the University of New Mexico, or at one of the New Mexico state museums. And final thoughts. Museum and archival collections are the inevitable result of routine park management operations and scientific investigations. There's always new material coming into the collections. Our job is to make the science remain replicable and make sure management decisions are both well-informed and transparent as possible. The curation of museum objects and archives never ends. We know we're slowing decay, we can't stop it, and we need to incorporate new scientific data into our knowledge of materials in their context. We need to implement the most recent science-based practices into our work, as long as they cause no harm. And we need to adjust our practices to show greater respect for the descendant communities, listening when we're asking to do things like not use the word artifact or other labels, and making sure we make items available for a visit from elders as necessary. Things that often go beyond the physical care of objects. Funding curation is difficult because people like to see an endpoint. We can complete a discrete project, but the work is never finished. Everything we do will have to be repeated, whether it's 2 years later, 10 years later, or 50 years later. And as a federal government unit, we are not eligible for most grant sources that private museums and archives access. Partnership with friends groups like the Chaco Culture Conservancy is critical because they can apply for and administer grants to complete projects on federal collections. But many of those grants also require matching funds, which is where their fundraising comes into play. We're truly grateful for past projects that have been made possible by the Chaco Culture Conservancy and the opportunities that they create for Chaco and Aztec, such as sharing more about the collections as part of their webinar series today. I do want to call out that New Mexico Archives Online project, where we have published information about the Chaco archival collections as appropriate. That work was funded for 2 years running by the Chaco Culture Conservancy. And the work to create the custom portal for Chaco on NP Gallery was funded by your fee dollars. So as we continue to do this work, try to make the collections more accessible, make sure they're discoverable so you know what's available, and to share and to use the museums for education and research and not as repositories of pretty things, this is where we need your help, and we need the help of the Chaco Culture Conservancy. So thank you for sharing International Museum Day with me today during this webinar. I really appreciate that you took the time to listen. So this is how to reach me. Sorry.
Go ahead, sorry.
I was just gonna say, this is how you reach me if you do have questions in the future, and I'll turn it back to Olivia.
Okay, sorry about that. Thank you so much, Cynthia. That was so educational, and I personally know that I learned a lot about the museum collections. We do have some time for a Q&A, and we do have one question in the chat about the Herbaria website. Can you remind us what that was?
Sure, I'll see if I can type it in. I might have to do it afterwards.
Okay.
It's spelled SEI net, and if you Google that, you can search herbarium specimens from really all over the country and even abroad. It just asks for simple questions like what state, if you know what county. So for Aztec, that'd be San Juan County. And I'm not aware of any Chaco specimens on there. I've not searched thoroughly, but most of the Chaco herbarium specimens do currently remain in our custody and care. They have not been provided to another institution at this time. So, but you might discover some on there that we're not aware of.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, so if anybody on here has any questions, you can go ahead and drop them in the chat. Questions about museum collections or archives, questions for Cynthia, questions about our partnership and the things that the CCC funds. In the meantime, I want to ask Cynthia, are these collections open for tours? And if so, how would people go about getting a tour?
Great question, Olivia. We have recently paused tours of the objects repository at the Chaco-Aztec Museum and Archives facility, as well as at the park units themselves, while we seek to understand the new duty of care regulations under NAGPRA. We want to make sure that we are applying them correctly and not inappropriately exhibiting to the public materials that qualify as sacred under the specific definition within those regulations. So while we grapple with that, to be respectful and appropriate, we are pausing that. However, you can still tour the archives repository in Albuquerque. There's no concern or issues there. And there's amazing materials that I didn't even talk about today there, including a drawing of Wajiji from 1877 by a photographer that came through, and his camera, he was trying out a new camera and his camera failed. I think we can all relate to when we used to buy new cameras and then you'd go on vacation and everything failed. So that's what happened, but he happened to be an amazing artist in pencil and drawings as well. And so we have that can be seen during a tour, and other really cool materials, scrapbooks, etc. So that remains open. If you're interested in getting a tour of the archives repository, reach out to me at my email, or go to our park website, and where our contact information is also there. Best to email us, and based on staff availability and our schedules, because we don't have a dedicated person to do this, we will work with you to put together a tour.
Awesome, thanks, Cynthia.
Sure.
We do have one question in the chat from Michael. He asks, have there been discussions about requesting repatriation of items in museum collections overseas, Finland, for example?
Great question, Michael. That gets into international law to some respect, in that unfortunately many other countries have more legal right to request repatriation of items from museums in the United States than vice versa. However, we as the National Park Service cannot request repatriation of those materials at all, because they were removed from they were removed from the land before we legally had title to the land. So we have no legal right to request those. Those requests would need to come from tribal and Pueblo governments. I will confess, I have little understanding of the mechanisms that would allow them to do it. They have more legal right to request those materials than we do. We are finding that as they are beginning to engage with NAGPRA, there's been a lot more private or other state level government museums are beginning to engage with NAGPRA now for the first time, really, or again in some cases. And we do find that they are finding materials in their collection that were illegally removed from the parks after their creation and were later donated then to them. In some cases, they don't qualify for NAGPRA because NAGPRA only applies to very specific objects. And then, of course, ancestral people. So in some cases, they're reaching out to us and trying to get things back to the parks, or in some cases to the tribes, because they say, they'll tell us, oh, I also have stuff from here. And I'm like, okay, you need to reach out to this tribal government. Here's their contact. And they're doing ethical returns, which is different because they're not legally mandated, but they're kind of also like, hey, I'm a state on the East Coast. Why should the state of East Coast have these items from Chaco or from Aztec? Like, this doesn't make sense for our collections. And then they're like, oh, and then I'm like, oh, well, actually they were legally taken. And then we're working to get them back. But for places like Finland and Oxford, the Park Service has no legal right to request that repatriation.
Great. Thanks so much, Cynthia.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't look like we have any other questions in our Q&A unless anybody has a lingering question to drop in the chat. So we'll go ahead and start wrapping it up. So I just want to say thank you so much again, Cynthia, for your wonderful talk. And thank you to all of our participants who joined us today. And if you're watching in the future. Before we leave, I want to take a moment again to remind you all to visit our website, sign up for our newsletter, and follow us on social media. We will be hosting more webinars throughout the year. So doing those things is a great way to keep up to date on what we're up to. So thank you again, everyone, and I hope that you have a great rest of your weekend. Thanks, Cynthia.
Thank you.